The moment Dorothy Finley rode into Harlan County, Texas, in the spring of 1878, the dust rose up around her like a curtain parting on a stage, and every man on the main street of Caldwell's Crossing stopped what he was doing to watch. She was not the kind of woman who went unnoticed. That much was apparent from the way she sat her saddle straight-backed and deliberate, her dark auburn hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, her gray dress travel-worn but neat, her green eyes scanning the town with the careful intelligence of someone who had learned not to trust anything on first appearance. She rode a chestnut mare that was tired but well cared for, and she led a second horse, a small pack animal, behind her on a rope. Whatever she owned in this world was strapped to that second horse's back, and it did not amount to very much. Dorothy Finley was 24 years old, and she had been riding for 11 days. She had come from Abilene, where the work had dried up after the cattle trade slowed, and the hotel where she had been employed as a housekeeper shut its doors with 2 weeks of back wages still unpaid. Before Abilene there had been Dodge City, and before Dodge City there had been the small farm outside of Wichita, Kansas, where she had grown up under the hand of her father, a bitter, land-poor man named Edmund Finley, who had passed away the previous autumn, leaving nothing behind but a mortgaged property and a lifetime of lessons in self-reliance. Dorothy had paid the mortgage with the last of her savings, let the land go to the bank, packed her 2 horses, and headed south into Texas because she had heard, from a traveling merchant she met on the road, that a rancher in Harlan County named Norris was looking for a bookkeeper and a household manager, and that he paid fairly and on time. Fair pay and reliability were, at this point in Dorothy's life, the closest things to paradise she could imagine. She tied her horses at the post outside a building marked with a faded sign that read General Store Caldwell's Crossing ESD, 1869, and she went inside. The man behind the counter was thick-necked and cheerful, with a flour-dusted apron and the look of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work. His name, as he introduced himself almost immediately, was Harlan Webb, and he was not the founder of the town. That distinction belonged to a man named Caldwell who had died of fever in 1871. But he had been here since nearly the beginning and knew everything about everything. Norris Ranch, Dorothy said, getting directly to the point in the way she always did, because she had found that directness saved time and time was always short. I was told a man named Norris is looking to hire. Is that still true, and can you tell me how to get there? Harlan Webb leaned on his counter and studied her with the unashamed curiosity of a man who lived in a small town. Albert Norris, he said. Yes, he put out word about 2 months ago that he needed someone who could manage his accounts and handle the household. He's had 3 applicants come through, sent all 3 away. Dorothy kept her expression neutral. What did they lack? Well now, Harlan said, the first one couldn't add a column of numbers to save his life, and Albert caught him in about 30 seconds. Second one came drunk. Third one was a woman from San Antonio who Albert said was overqualified and $2 grand for the work, though most people think he just got nervous. Harlan paused and allowed himself a small smile. Albert Norris is a fine man, Miss Finley. Dorothy Finley. Miss Finley. Albert Norris is a fine man. He's honest and he's fair and he's built the best cattle operation in 3 counties. He's been on his own a long time and he's not always easy to read. Dorothy nodded once. How do I get there? Harlan Webb gave her directions, sold her a tin of crackers and a small wedge of hard cheese because she looked like someone who had been skipping meals, refused to let her pay full price, and watched her walk out the door with an expression that combined admiration and something close to sympathy. The Norris Ranch was 7 miles east of town, and the road to it wound through country that made Dorothy's chest tighten with a feeling she could not immediately name. The land was wide and golden and enormous, rolling out under a sky so blue it looked painted, broken only by distant hills and the occasional dark line of a creek bed. The grass moved in long, slow waves when the wind came through. There were cattle on the distant slopes, hundreds of them, small dark shapes against the gold. It was beautiful in the way that truly wild things are beautiful, without caring whether you appreciated it or not. She had been riding through the gate and up the long drive for 5 minutes before she saw the house. It was larger than she expected. Not grand, not the kind of house that announced wealth as its primary purpose, but solid and well-proportioned, built from good timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that caught the afternoon light. There were several outbuildings in good repair, a barn that could have housed 30 horses, a cookhouse, what looked like a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and beyond all of it, a series of corrals where men were working with horses. Dorothy did not slow her pace. She rode directly to the front of the house, dismounted cleanly, tied her horses, walked up the porch steps and knocked. The man who opened the door was not what she expected, and later, when she tried to understand why he had surprised her so thoroughly, she could not quite put her finger on it. He was 32 years old, though she did not know that yet. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind that made doorframes look slightly inadequate, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of brown eyes that managed to be both warm and watchful at the same time. He wore working clothes, not the clothes of a man who had been sitting behind a desk, and his hands and forearms carried the evidence of real outdoor work. He had a jaw that was square and stubbled, and a mouth that might have been stern if not for the slight uncertainty around the corners that softened it considerably. He looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at him. "Mr. Norris," she said. "Yes," he said. "My name is Dorothy Finley. I came about the position." "I heard you needed a bookkeeper and household manager." Albert Norris blinked slowly. "You rode here from where?" "I came from Abilene most recently, before that Dodge City." He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who is thinking more than he is letting on. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in then," he said. "I'll make coffee." The inside of the house was clean but not particularly organized. Dorothy could see that someone, Albert himself, she suspected, made efforts at order that were not quite successful. The way a man who understood systems in the abstract but had too many other demands on his time might manage a domestic space. The furniture was good and heavy, built to last. The fireplace was large. There were books on a shelf, real books, more than she might have anticipated, and papers on the desk in the corner that were arranged in stacks with a kind of earnest optimism about what constituted filing. She sat at the kitchen table because that was where he gestured, and she watched him make coffee with the efficient movements of a man who had done it 10,000 times by himself. "Where did you work before Abilene?" he asked, his back to her. "Dodge City. Before the hotel there reduced its staff. Before that I kept accounts for a dry goods merchant in Wichita for 2 years. I have a letter of reference from him." She reached into the bag she carried and produced an envelope. "I also have a reference from my employer in Abilene, though I should tell you that establishment closed down for business reasons that had nothing to do with my work." He turned and took the letters, read them both at the table while the coffee finished, and read them the way a man reads something when he genuinely intends to understand it carefully, without rushing, going back to reread certain sections. "Hector Drummond speaks well of you," he said, referring to the Wichita merchant. "He says you found an error in his inventory accounting that saved him several $100s. He was being overcharged by one of his suppliers. The discrepancies were small enough individually that they had gone unnoticed for about 18 months. I noticed them because I pay attention to patterns." Albert set the letters down and poured coffee into 2 cups and set one in front of her. He sat down across from her and looked at her with those watchful brown eyes, and Dorothy met his gaze directly because she had never found anything useful in looking away. "Tell me what you think a bookkeeper and household manager does on a working cattle ranch," he said. "The books first," she said. "Payroll for the hands, accounts payable and receivable, tracking cattle inventory and sales records, monitoring expenses against revenue, and identifying where money is being lost or inefficiently spent. The household management means ensuring the house and cooking operation runs smoothly. I'm not a cook myself, but I can coordinate one managing supplies, making sure the men are properly provisioned, and keeping the general operation from grinding to a halt because someone forgot to order salt or lamp oil. Albert nodded slowly. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I have 12 full-time hands and 4 seasonal workers during roundup. My current bookkeeping is, he paused, not ideal. How long has it been since your accounts were properly reconciled? A beat of silence. 14 months. Dorothy breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and did not allow herself to wince. All right, she said. I should also tell you, Albert said, that my cook left 3 months ago to go back to San Antonio, and I have been managing the cooking arrangements for the men with varying degrees of success. What does that mean? It means 2 of my best hands nearly quit in February because of the food situation. I see. I'm not asking you to cook, he said. I just want you to know the full scope of what's needed. Dorothy looked around the kitchen. She looked at the paper stacks visible through the doorway of the study. She looked at this large, serious, quietly earnest man sitting across from her with his hands around his coffee cup, and she thought about 11 days of riding, and the hotel in Abilene that had not paid her what it owed her, and the farm in Wichita that was now someone else's land. And she thought about what fair pay and reliability meant to a person who had built her entire adult life on nothing more substantial than her own competence and her willingness to work. "What are you offering for wages?" she asked. He told her a number. It was fair. It was, in fact, slightly above fair, which surprised her. "Room and board included?" she asked. "There is a room in the house. You would have privacy. I have no family here. It is just me and the hands are in the bunkhouse." Dorothy nodded. "I also want to be straightforward with you," Albert said, and there was something in the shift of his voice that made her pay closer attention. "This position has been vacant for a while because I have been particular about who I offer it to. Not because I enjoy being difficult, but because I don't like replacing people every 6 months. If I offer this position to someone, I want it to be someone who intends to stay." "I intend to work," Dorothy said. "I have no objection to staying if the work suits me and I am treated fairly." Albert looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up, went to his desk in the study, and came back with a document that he set on the table between them. Dorothy looked at it. It was a deed, a property deed for a parcel of land on the east edge of the ranch, 40 acres of good pasture land with a creek running through it. She stared at it. "Mr. Norris," she said, very carefully. "This parcel has been sitting unused for 3 years, he said. "I bought it at the same time I expanded the main property, thinking I would build another structure on it, but I never did. I want to offer you a different arrangement than straight wages." He sat back down and met her eyes steadily. "I want to offer you a share in this operation. Not wages alone, though the wages still stand, but a formal stake. 10% of net revenue and that parcel of land deeded to you in exchange for a 3-year commitment. At the end of 3 years, we renegotiate." Dorothy sat very still for a moment. "I realize," Albert said, "that this is an unusual offer." "It is an extraordinary offer," Dorothy said. "Why would you offer this to someone you met 15 minutes ago?" Something shifted in his expression, not defensiveness, but honesty, the kind that costs something to show. "Because I have been running this ranch for 8 years and I have been doing it alone for most of that time, and I know what it costs. I know what it costs in hours and in worry and in the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from the body but from the head. I have good men, good hands. But there is no one here who thinks about this place the way I think about it, as a whole, as a system, as something that has to last." He paused. "You noticed an 18-month accounting discrepancy in a dry goods store. You rode 11 days from Abilene on your own. You sat down in my kitchen and answered every question before I finished asking it." A very small pause. "I am offering you a stake because I think you are the kind of person who works differently when they own something than when they are merely employed. and I think this place needs that." Dorothy looked at the deed. She looked at the man across from her. She thought about the 40 acres with the creek running through it, which she had not seen yet but which she was already, against all of her practical instincts, imagining. "I will need to see the books before I commit to anything," she said. "If the accounts are in the condition you suggest, I need to know the full extent of what I'm agreeing to take on." "Of course," Albert said. "And I will need to inspect the room and the household provisions. Also fair. And I want to review that deed with a clear head, not the head I have right now after 11 days on the road." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face, though it didn't quite complete itself. "You can review it tomorrow," he said. "Stay tonight. There's a room made up." Dorothy looked at him one more moment. Then she nodded once. "All right," she said. The room was on the east side of the house, with a window that looked out toward those rolling hills and the distant cattle. The bed was solid and the linens were clean, and Dorothy sat on the edge of it that first evening and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into nighttime, the cattle in the distance, the voices of men from the bunkhouse, the creak of the house itself, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she might be in the right place. She had no way of knowing yet what that feeling would eventually mean. But it was there, quiet and stubborn as a seed in dry ground, and she let it sit there without examining it too hard, the way you let a fire take hold before you start loading it with wood. The next morning, Dorothy rose before dawn, which was her habit, and by the time Albert came downstairs she had already made coffee, found the household inventory that had been kept with what she was already recognizing as Albert's particular brand of earnest but insufficient organization, and begun making a list. Albert came into the kitchen, saw her at the table with papers spread around her and a cup of coffee at her elbow, and stopped in the doorway with an expression that she would remember later as the first time she caught a glimpse of the man beneath the careful, quiet exterior. He looked just for a moment like a man who had not realized how much he had been hoping for exactly this. "Coffee's on," she said, not looking up from the inventory. "I can see that," he said. He poured himself a cup and sat down across from her, and after a moment he said, "You found the inventory sheets." They were in the second drawer of the kitchen dresser under a seed catalog from 1875 and what I believe is a bill of sale for a horse. "You should establish a location system. That has been pointed out to me before." "By whom?" "My mother mostly before she passed, and my foreman Cobb, who is not subtle about his opinions." Dorothy looked up at him then. He was backlit by the early morning coming through the window, and for a moment the light caught the angles of his face in a way that made her forget briefly what she had been about to say. She recovered herself and said, "I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you," he said simply. "She died 4 years ago. She was the one who really ran the household. After she passed, things deteriorated somewhat in that regard." "I gathered," Dorothy said, but not unkindly. They worked together that morning in a way that felt, to both of them, remarkable in its ease. Albert pulled the account books from the study and spread them on the kitchen table, and Dorothy went through them page by page while Albert answered her questions. And she had many questions with a patient directness that she found she respected enormously. He was not defensive about the disorganization. He simply told her the truth of the situation, which was that he was a man who knew cattle and land and weather and men, and who had always been weakest in the areas of systematic record-keeping, and that the books had gotten away from him during a particularly bad stretch 2 winters ago when he had lost 100 head to cold and illness, and had spent several months simply trying to keep the operation alive rather than accounting for it. "You lost 100 head in the winter of 1876, Dorothy said, finding the entry in the records. 78 that year, but yes. And then a dispute with a neighboring property over water rights the following spring took up most of my attention for several months." Dorothy paused. "Water rights. The creek that runs through the east parcel, the one in the deed I showed you, there was a question about whether the Harmon family, who hold the land to the north, had prior claim to divert it. We settled it. The creek is mine, or rather, it belongs to this property. But the legal process took most of 1877. Dorothy nodded slowly and made a note. The east parcel with the creek was looking more significant with every piece of information she gathered. A water source in this country was not a trivial thing. It was, in many ways, the difference between land that was useful and land that was not. By midday she had a preliminary picture of the financial state of the Norris Ranch, and it was both better and worse than Albert had suggested. Better because the core operation was fundamentally sound. His cattle were quality stock, his grazing management was intelligent, and his men were loyal and competent. Worse because the lack of systematic accounting had allowed small inefficiencies to compound over time, and she estimated that the ranch was losing somewhere between 8 and 12% of its annual revenue to a combination of overpayment to suppliers, undercollection from some cattle sales, and at least 2 instances of what looked like outright error in the recording of transactions, errors that she suspected, given the dates and amounts, might not have been entirely accidental. She told Albert this over a lunch of bread and salt pork that she had assembled from the somewhat sparse kitchen provisions. He went very still when she got to the part about the potentially non-accidental errors. Who handled the books before, she asked. A man named Cray. He left about 14 months ago. Why did he leave? He said he had an opportunity in Dallas. Albert's voice was even and measured in the way of a man who is recalibrating something. You're telling me Cray may have been. I'm telling you that 2 transactions have entries that don't correspond to any other record I can find in your files, and that the amounts involved, added together, come to just over $300. I could be wrong. I may be missing records. But before you take any action on that, I would need to go through everything more carefully. How long would that take? 3 or 4 days of focused work. Do it, Albert said. Pause, please, Dorothy nodded. She looked at the bread and salt pork on the table between them and said, You need a cook. Who is making the hands meals right now? We have been rotating. Tom Briggs, one of my hands, does passable biscuits. Otherwise it has been whatever can be managed. Is there anyone in town who might be interested in the position? There is a woman, Mrs. Paulina Reyes, who cooked at the boarding house until it changed ownership last month. I don't know if she's looked for new work. Send someone into town to ask her tomorrow, Dorothy said. The hands' productivity will improve if they're properly fed. That's not an opinion, it's a practical certainty. Albert looked at her across the table with an expression she was still learning to read. She would come to understand, over the weeks that followed, that when Albert Norris looked at someone with that particular quiet attention, it meant he was feeling something he had not yet found words for, and that he was, by nature, a man who needed words before he could act on feelings. It was both his greatest strength, and in some ways, the thing that had kept him alone for longer than was perhaps good for him. What she did not yet know was that he was already, in some quiet and unexamined corner of himself, wondering what this woman's laugh sounded like, and whether she always sat with that particular straight-backed, self-contained dignity that made her look like someone who had never in her life needed to be rescued. Dorothy spent the next 4 days at the desk in the study, and she worked with the focused intensity of someone who found genuine satisfaction in bringing order from disorder. She reorganized the filing system. She reconciled 14 months of accounts. She found the Cray discrepancies, and they were discrepancies, not errors. She was confident of that by the end and documented them carefully. She made a full inventory of household supplies and provisions. She established a purchasing schedule that she estimated would reduce supply costs by 15% through consolidation and better negotiation with suppliers. She also, in the evenings after the work was done, sat on the wide porch in the cooling air and watched the sky change over the Texas hills. Albert would often come and sit in the other chair. There were 2 chairs on the porch, which she found interesting, as though the house had always known there should be 2 people living in it, and they would talk. Not always about the ranch. They talked about other things, about books, It turned out they had read several of the same ones and disagreed productively about at least two of them, about the country they had both traveled through, about Kansas, which Dorothy knew well and Albert had passed through once in his youth on his way south from Missouri, where he had been born, about the war, which had ended before either of them was old enough to have served, but which had shaped the world they had grown into in ways that were impossible to ignore, about the land and what it meant to own it, or to try to, and the way that meaning changed depending on who was doing the owning and who was watching them do it. It was on one of those evenings, the fifth day she was at the ranch, that Dorothy mentioned the injustice she had seen in her travels, the way that Comanche and Kiowa families who had lived on these lands for generations had been pushed from them by force, the way that the land they were all now calling Texas had changed hands through a sequence of events, that the people most affected by those events had never been asked about or given a voice in. She said it carefully, because she was not sure how Albert Norris thought about such things, and she was not yet willing to be reckless with the beginnings of a working relationship she valued. Albert was quiet for a moment after she spoke. Then he said, "The Comanche had a camp on the eastern edge of this property when my father first came through this country in 1852. There was a family, I was told this by an older man in town who remembered it, who had a spring camp on the creek that runs through the east parcel. They were moved off the land in a manner that no one who was there seemed to want to describe in detail." Dorothy looked at him. "It is not a thing that sits comfortably with me," Albert said. "I know that I hold this land by a title that was only made possible by a sequence of events I had no part in but have benefited from nonetheless." He turned his cup in his hands. "I don't know what the right response to that is. I suspect no one does entirely, but I think pretending it didn't happen is the worst option." Dorothy nodded slowly. "That is more than most people are willing to say. Most people find it easier not to think about it." "Yes," she said. They were quiet together for a while after that, watching the stars appear over the hills one by one, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people have just learned something important about each other and are taking a moment to let it settle. Mrs. Paulina Reyes arrived the following week, a broad-shouldered, efficient woman of 45 with iron-gray hair and an opinion about everything, who took one look at the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and had a proper meal on the table for 12 men within 3 hours of arriving. The hands received her with the gratitude of men who had been subsisting on Tom Briggs's biscuits for 3 months. Albert looked like a man who had been rescued from a particular kind of slow catastrophe. Dorothy liked Paulina immediately, and the feeling appeared to be mutual. Paulina Reyes had a directness and a competence that Dorothy recognized and admired, and Paulina, for her part, recognized in Dorothy the kind of woman who knew what she was about and did not waste time pretending otherwise. They established a productive working relationship within the first 2 days, and Dorothy found that having Paulina in the household lifted a considerable weight from her own list of concerns, allowing her to focus more completely on the financial work. She signed the deed on the 8th day. Albert had left it on the desk without comment when she came down that morning, and she had sat with it for 20 minutes before picking up the pen. She was not impulsive by nature. She had examined the proposition from every angle she could think of, had gone through the financial picture of the ranch carefully enough to understand what a 10% stake actually represented in concrete terms, had thought about the 40 acres with the creek and what they might mean to a woman who had not owned any land in her life and had not expected to. She picked up the pen and signed her name in her clear, even hand. Dorothy Ann Finley. Albert came in from the morning's work to find the signed deed on the desk and Dorothy at the kitchen table with her coffee and her lists, and he stood in the study doorway for a moment and looked at his own name on the deed and her name beneath it and said nothing for a moment that stretched just long enough for her to look up. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the almost smile she had seen before, but the real one, full and sudden and transformative. the kind of smile that changes a person's whole face and makes you realize you have been looking at something that was always going to be beautiful once it opened up. Dorothy felt the impact of it somewhere in her chest, quiet as a stone dropping into water, and she looked back at her papers with the focused attention of a woman who was not going to let anyone, including herself, know what she had just felt. It had been 8 days. She was not foolish. She was not reckless. She was Dorothy Finley, who had built everything she had on the bedrock of her own practical intelligence, and she was not about to compromise any of that because a man had a remarkable smile. She told herself this firmly and went back to her lists. The weeks that followed were among the most demanding and the most satisfying of Dorothy's adult life. The ranch work had a rhythm that she came to understand quickly. The pre-dawn mornings, the cycles of the cattle operation, the way weather determined everything and could be prepared for only so far before you simply had to respond to what arrived. She was not a cattlewoman in the practical sense. She did not ride out on roundups or work the corrals, but she understood the financial and logistical dimensions of the operation with increasing depth, and she brought that understanding to bear with a focused energy that transformed the administrative side of the ranch within 6 weeks. Albert's foreman, a weathered man named Cobb Whittaker who had been with the ranch for 6 years, and had the kind of face that looked like it had been cut from the same material as the land, was initially cautious about Dorothy. He was not hostile. He was too professional for hostility toward someone Albert had brought in, but he watched her with the careful attention of a man who was reserving his judgment. He revised his position the morning Dorothy caught an error in the feed supplier's billing that would have cost the ranch $47, and pointed it out to the supplier's representative in terms that were polite and completely unambiguous, and resulted in an immediate correction. "That woman is sharp as a new blade," Cobb told Albert that evening, as Dorothy had overheard from just inside the open barn door, not intentionally but with the stillness of someone who had learned to listen. "I know," Albert said. "You did something right hiring her." "I think so too," Albert said, and something in his voice was very quiet when he said it. In the evenings, the porch chairs. In the afternoons, when the work allowed, sometimes a walk along the property Albert had begun, in the natural course of showing her the operation, to take her out riding, and Dorothy had discovered that she loved this land in a way she had not expected and could not entirely explain. The open expanse of it, the wide sky, the way the light changed over the hills from gold to rose to purple in the hour before dark, and the way the cattle moved across the slopes like a slow tide. She was learning the land. She was also, without having decided to, learning Albert Norris. He was a man of considerable feeling that he carried quietly, the way you carry something heavy that you have learned to balance so well that people sometimes don't realize you're carrying it at all. He was patient with his men in a way that earned genuine loyalty rather than mere compliance. He was honest to a degree that occasionally cost him money. She watched him honor a handshake agreement with a neighboring rancher over a cattle purchase, even when the market price shifted unfavorably, because the agreement had been made, and his word was his word. He read his books in the evenings when the work was done, and when he was worried about something he went silent in a particular way that she learned to recognize, and when she asked him directly what he was thinking, he always told her. That last quality she found increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. She did not realize she was falling in love with him. That was not quite accurate. She realized it in pieces. The way you realize a storm is coming not all at once, but in a sequence of small signs that only add up to a conclusion when you stop and put them together. The way she listened for his step on the stairs in the morning. The way she found herself structuring her reports to include the information she knew he found most interesting, not just the most financially significant items. The way the sight of him walking in from the corrals in the late afternoon, tired and dirty and completely himself, made her feel something she had given up expecting to feel. She put it aside. She was practical. She had a job to do and a stake in this operation, and she was not going to muddle either with something as unpredictable as feeling. She had watched feelings ruin sensible arrangements before, and she had no intention of becoming an example of that particular lesson. She was approximately 6 weeks into telling herself this when the matter of Wade Harmon came to a head. Wade Harmon was the son of the family that held the land to the north, the ones who had disputed the water rights to the creek on the east parcel. He was 28 years old, broadly built, loud in the way of a man who has been told all his life that his loudness is authority, and he appeared at the Norris Ranch on a Tuesday morning in June without announcement, while Albert was out on the range, and presented himself at the front door to speak to someone in charge. Dorothy answered the door. Harmon looked at her with the particular surprise that men of his type displayed when a woman appeared in a context where they expected a man. "I'm here to speak with Norris," he said. "Mr. Norris is not available right now. I'm Dorothy Finley, the ranch manager. Is there something I can help you with?" Harmon's eyes moved over her in a way that was not respectful and not particularly subtle. "The ranch manager," he repeated. "That's right." "Well, Miss Finley," he said, "I don't have business with the ranch manager. I have business with Albert Norris." "Then I suggest you come back when he's available or leave a message and I will make sure he receives it." Harmon stepped closer to the doorframe, and Dorothy did not step back, because she had decided a long time ago that she was not going to be made small by men who thought that stepping forward was a power. "My family has a claim on that East Parcel Creek," he said, "and we've been patient about the legal situation, but patience isn't unlimited. We're looking at diverting that water for our northern range, and we'd like to discuss it with Norris directly." "The water rights for that creek were settled in 1877, Dorothy said. "They are documented and legally binding. That parcel and the creek that runs through it is now part of my deed, a deed that is properly recorded with the county. Any attempt to divert that water would be a legal violation of a documented property right, and I would encourage you to speak with a lawyer before you proceed with any such plan." Harmon stared at her. "Your deed?" "My deed," Dorothy said, without inflection. He left. Dorothy watched him ride away down the drive and then closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing carefully, because she was angrier than she had allowed herself to show, and the anger needed somewhere to go. Albert came back in from the range an hour later, and she told him about the visit in a straightforward, factual account. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He came to the house while I was out and spoke to you that way." "He spoke to me the way he speaks to everyone who is not him," Dorothy said. "It is not remarkable." "It is remarkable to me," Albert said, and the quiet in his voice had a quality she had not heard before. It was not anger exactly. It was something more controlled than anger, the kind of thing that exists underneath anger in a person who has trained himself not to let it out without good reason. "I handled it," Dorothy said. "I know you did," he said. "That's not the point." He rode to the Harmon property the next morning, and she did not know exactly what was said. But Wade Harmon did not come back to the Norris Ranch, and the question of the East Parcel Creek did not arise again. Cobb Whitaker, who had apparently heard something about the exchange from one of the hands, found Dorothy in the barn that afternoon and said, with the economy of a man who did not waste words, "Albert Norris hasn't ridden to talk to another man about how that man treated someone in about 7 years. Dorothy looked at Cobb steadily. "Is that so?" "Last time was on behalf of his mother," Cobb said, and walked away. Dorothy stood in the barn for a moment with the sound of horses around her and thought about what that meant, and felt something warm and inconvenient move through her chest, and went back to work. It was not inconvenience, of course. She knew what it was by now. She had simply been choosing, for practical and sensible reasons, not to call it by its name. July came in hot and dry, and the work of the ranch intensified as the summer grazing season reached its peak. Dorothy found herself increasingly in the rhythm of the place, knowing the names of all the hands, knowing the feeding schedule and the rotation schedule, and the cattle count to within a dozen head on any given day. She had also, in her reorganized files, found documentation that allowed her to recover $112 from the questionable Cray transactions, not by confronting anyone since Cray was long gone and in Dallas, but by documenting the discrepancy and adjusting the accounts so the ranch's recorded position was accurate. Albert looked at the adjusted account book and said, very quietly, "I should have had this looked at sooner." "Yes," Dorothy said, "but you were managing a great deal." "That's a generous assessment. It is an accurate one." He looked up at her then, and they were standing close together over the account book, closer than they usually stood, and for a moment neither of them moved. The late afternoon was all around them, golden through the study windows, and from outside came the sounds of the ranch going about its evening, men's voices, horses, the distant bawl of cattle. And in the study there was just the two of them and the narrow space between them, and the account book open on the desk that neither of them was looking at. "Dorothy," Albert said. Her name in his voice was different from how it sounded anywhere else. She had noticed this before and not allowed herself to comment on it, even internally. She was noticing it now with considerably more difficulty in the ignoring. "Yes," she said. He closed the account book. "I want to say something, and I am aware that I may be entirely mistaken in how I am reading everything. So if I am mistaken, I would like you to tell me plainly, and I will not raise it again, and there will be no awkwardness in this house or in this arrangement." Dorothy looked at him. Her heart was beating in a way that she found physiologically inconvenient. "All right," she said. "I have valued this place for 8 years, Albert said. "I have worked for it and worried over it and poured everything I had into it, and it has given back what hard work and good land will give back. But I have been lonely in it, and I did not entirely understand that until you came." He stopped. He was choosing words with the careful precision of a man who understood that some things, once said, cannot be unsaid, and who wanted very badly to say the right ones. "You sat down in my kitchen on the first day, and you were practical and clear, and you asked the right questions, and you signed the deed, and you caught the Harmon boy by the throat without raising your voice, and you sit on this porch in the evenings and you talk to me about books and about the land and about the things that matter. And I find that I have become—" He stopped again. "Albert," Dorothy said. "I have become very attached to the thought of you being here," he said. "Not just as the manager of this operation, though that is genuine, but as you, Dorothy, here." He met her eyes with the directness that she had always liked about him, the honesty that cost him something but that he offered anyway. "I want to know if you have any feeling in that direction, or if I have been entirely misreading a professional relationship." Dorothy Finley, who was practical and self-contained, and had spent most of her adult life making sure that she was never dependent on anything she hadn't built herself, stood in the golden afternoon in Albert Norris's study and realized that she had two choices. She could do what she had spent 2 months doing, keeping the feeling at arm's length with both hands, labeling it as inconvenient, telling herself it was premature and potentially disruptive and professionally complicated. Or she could be as honest as he had just been, because honesty was something she respected above almost everything, and because he had just shown her something real about himself, and he deserved something real in return. "I have not been misreading anything," she said. "And you have not been misreading me." She looked at him steadily. "I came here for work. I came because I needed a position, and I was told the pay was fair and reliable, and those things mattered enormously to me because I had very little else. And both of those things have proven true, and my stake in this place is something I care about deeply as an independent fact." She paused. "And separately from all of that, and without any plan or expectation on my part, I have found you. And I do not mean this ranch, though this ranch is a very good thing. I mean you as a person. And yes, I have feeling in that direction, very considerable feeling." Albert looked at her for one long moment. Then he stepped forward and took her hand. He was careful, deliberate, as though she were something that might take flight if he moved too quickly, and held it in both of his, the way he held his coffee cup in the mornings, and said, I am very glad you rode into this county." Dorothy looked at their hands together and felt something unknot in her chest that she had not realized was tied. "So am I," she said. They did not rush what came next, because neither of them was the rushing kind, and also because they both understood, without having to discuss it, that they were building something that was meant to last, and things meant to last needed to be built carefully. There were long evening conversations on the porch that became something else. Not just two people thinking aloud together, but two people discovering each other. The slow and extraordinary process of learning someone's mind, and finding that it fits with yours in places you did not know needed fitting. Albert told her about Missouri and his childhood, about his father who had been a stern and not always kind man, but who had loved the land with a genuineness that Albert had inherited. Dorothy told him about Kansas and Edmund Finley, and the years of running a household that was always slightly short of everything, about the way she had learned to be sufficient unto herself, because no other option had presented itself, about the hotel in Abilene and the 11 days of riding, and the moment she had seen Harlan County from the road and felt, inexplicably, that she might be arriving somewhere rather than simply departing. Albert listened to her the way she had always wanted to be listened to, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually hearing, actually taking in what she said and turning it over and responding to the real content of it. In August, he asked her to ride out with him to see the East Parcel properly, and they spent an afternoon walking the 40 acres that were hers, that were legally and actually hers. And she stood at the edge of the creek and watched the water move over the pale stones and felt something she had no word for that was larger and quieter than happiness. Albert stood beside her. "What will you do with it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Something good." She looked at him. "Something that stays." He took her hand then, standing at the edge of her creek, and they stood there while the water moved past and the afternoon light turned everything it touched into gold. And Dorothy Finley understood, in a way she had not understood anything this clearly in her life, that she was not going to let this go. In September, Albert asked her to marry him. He did not do it grandly or with any theatrical ceremony. He did it on the porch in the evening, with 2 cups of coffee on the railing and the stars beginning to show and the sounds of the ranch settling into night. He said her name, and she looked at him, and he said, "I would like us to be married if you are willing." Dorothy sat with it for a moment that was longer than the moment required, because she was Dorothy and she was always thorough, and also because she wanted to be sure, genuinely sure, not just moved by the warmth of the evening and the feeling of being wanted, that what she felt was what she thought it was. It was. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." Albert looked at her with the smile, the real one, the one that changed his whole face, and reached over and covered her hand with his on the railing, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. They were married in October, in the church in Caldwell's Crossing, which was not a grand church, but was solid and well kept and smelled of pine and candle wax. Harlan Webb from the general store attended with his wife, a small bright-eyed woman named Clara who cried with undisguised happiness throughout the ceremony. Cobb Whitaker stood up with Albert with the expression of a man who is deeply moved but would die before admitting it. Paulina Reyes, who had become in the space of a few months something very close to family, sat in the front row with a handkerchief that she used extensively. The hands from the ranch came in their best clothes, which were not always their cleanest clothes but were their most earnest ones. The minister, a kind older man named Reverend Pierce, read the words with the quiet authority of someone who had officiated many marriages, and understood that this one, like the best of them, was not a social formality but a genuine reckoning between two people with their eyes open. Dorothy wore a dress that Paulina had helped her alter, her best one, deep green that matched her eyes, with new trim that Paulina had sourced from Harlan Webb's store. She had pinned her auburn hair up in a way that was more careful than usual, and she looked, in Albert's view, which was documented by nothing more permanent than the expression on his face as she walked toward him down the short aisle, like the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen in his life. He had thought about how to tell her this for 3 days, and had not yet found words adequate to the task. He settled for holding her hand very steadily throughout the ceremony and hoping that she understood. She did. After, there was a supper at the ranch. Paulina and 2 women from town had spent the day preparing it, and the yard was lit with lanterns, and the October air was cool and clean, and the men from the bunkhouse played music that was enthusiastic if not always precise, and Dorothy Finley, who was now Dorothy Norris, and who was still deciding how she felt about that particular change, danced with her husband on the packed earth of the yard and looked up at him in the lantern light, and thought that she had been very, very wrong about what she was hoping for when she rode into Harlan County. She had been hoping for fair pay and reliability. What she had found was this: a man who listened, and land that was hers, and a life that was being built by 2 people who knew how to work and who had between them enough love for everything that needed it. The first winter of their marriage was a good one. Cold, but not the punishing cold of 1876. The cattle losses were minimal. The house was warm, and the life inside it was something that Dorothy had not known she was building toward but recognized, now that she was in it, as exactly right. She and Albert had the ease together that comes not from effortlessness, but from 2 people who have already done the work of knowing each other, and they moved through their days with a complementary competence that made the ranch run better than it had in years. She kept the books, meticulously, beautifully, with a system she had built from the ground up, and that Albert could now read himself, because she had taught him to, and that she intended to teach their eventual children too, because she believed that financial literacy was something everyone deserved and most people were not given. She managed the household and the provisions and the supply negotiations with a skill that had, by the end of the first year, reduced operating costs by nearly 20% while improving the quality of what was produced. She developed an independent relationship with the East Parcel, her 40 acres, where she had begun to plant a kitchen garden and an orchard of sorts, native trees and a few cultivated ones, along the creek bank, and she had plans for a small structure there eventually, a place for the extra hands to stay during roundup, or for something else she hadn't fully defined yet. Albert watched all of this with a love that had grown from the first day's admiration into something richer and steadier and deeper than admiration. The love of a man who has seen a person be fully themselves in every weather and has found them in all of it to be exactly who he had hoped they were. He was not always easy to read. She had not expected him to be. She had met him knowing he was not, and she had stayed anyway, and in staying she had learned the particular landscape of him. The way his silences meant different things, the way his worry showed in his hands, the way he came alive when he talked about the land or the cattle or about books or about her. He was a man who loved deeply and specifically and did not spread it thin, and when it was directed at her, it had the quality of something enormous made quiet, which she found both humbling and, in the way of things that humble you genuinely, transformative. In the spring following their wedding, Dorothy discovered she was expecting a child. She told Albert on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee, with the directness that was simply how she was, and his response was not immediate. He went very still, the way he went still when something was significant enough that his whole system needed a moment to process it. Then he looked at her across the table, and what was on his face was so unguarded and so enormous that Dorothy, who was not given to tears under ordinary circumstances, felt her eyes sting. "Dorothy," he said. It was not a full sentence. It did not need to be. "Yes," she said. He came around the table and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, which was something she had learned to do without fighting herself about it. The leaning, the being held, the allowing of another person's steadiness to be real. She had learned that it did not cost her her own steadiness. It simply meant that she had more. Their son was born in October of 1879, exactly 1 year after their wedding, and they named him Edmund Albert Norris Edmund for Dorothy's father, complicated as that memory was, because she believed in acknowledging where you came from, and Albert for the man who had made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, that where she was going mattered as much as where she had been. Edmund was a healthy, loud, imperious child who from his first weeks on earth appeared to have opinions about everything and no hesitation in expressing them, which Paulina Reyes, who treated him with the devotion of a grandmother, declared was clearly a combination of both his parents and therefore entirely inevitable. Albert held his son with a tenderness that Dorothy watched from across the room and felt, every time, as something just slightly too large for words. He was a man who had not known he had this in him, this specific gentleness, this particular willingness to be remade by something small and loud and entirely dependent. He adapted to fatherhood the way he adapted to everything, with a committed seriousness that gradually relaxed into something more natural, and with a love that had no self-consciousness in it at all. Edmund grew, as children do, at a pace that made the days feel both endless and impossible in their brevity. Dorothy managed her maternal responsibilities with the same organized competence that she brought to everything, but there was also, and this was the thing she had not fully anticipated, joy. A joy that was specific and irreducible, the joy of this particular child in this particular life, which was nothing she had planned and everything she had not known to want. The ranch flourished. In the 3 years following Dorothy's arrival, the operation that Albert Norris had built with 8 years of solitary hard work became something stronger and more complete, the way a structure becomes stronger when a second key element is placed in it. The books were clear, and the accounts were healthy, and the hands were well-fed and fairly paid and loyal to a degree that Cobb Whitaker, not a sentimental man, described as unusual and remarkable. The east parcel was producing, the orchard had begun to bear fruit, the garden was a genuine resource, and Dorothy had, in the spring of 1880, built the small structure she had planned. A solid one-room building by the creek, which she had decided would serve as a schoolroom, because the handful of children of the ranch hands had no school within reasonable distance, and she had no intention of watching any child grow up without the education she believed was their right. She taught there herself on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and Cobb Whitaker's niece, a 20-year-old named Pearl who had proper schoolteacher training, came out from town on Monday and Wednesday mornings. The 5 children who initially attended became 9 by the end of the first year, as word spread among the families in the surrounding area. Dorothy wrote letters to the county administration about the possibility of establishing a proper school district. She did not expect immediate results. She had learned in the years of her life that the important things were rarely immediate, but she did not stop writing the letters. Albert knew about the letters. He thought about them often. He thought about the woman who had ridden into his county on a tired chestnut mare looking for bookkeeping work, and who had signed a deed in his kitchen without flinching, and who now ran a ranch, and raised his son and taught reading to children on Tuesday afternoons, and sent letters to county administrators about school districts. And he thought that he had offered her a stake in his operation, and she had taken it and turned it into something larger than he had imagined, and that this was simply who she was, and that he loved her for it in a way that was completely without limit. In 1881, Harlan County established a proper school district, the first in the region. The schoolroom on the east parcel became its first official site, and Pearl Whitaker Cobb's niece was appointed its first certified teacher, a position she took with a seriousness that made her uncle's unexpressive face arrange itself, privately, into something close to pride. Dorothy attended the official opening with Albert on one arm and 14-month-old Edmund on the other, and she stood in the doorway of the small building she had planned by the creek and felt the specific satisfaction of someone who has built something that will outlast them. "You did this," Albert said quietly, standing beside her. "We did this," Dorothy said. "This is your land." "Our land," he said. She looked at him. "Our land," she agreed. That year also brought word from Abilene that the hotel that had failed to pay Dorothy her last 2 weeks of wages had come under new ownership, and that the new owner, a scrupulously honest businessman named Garrett, had been going through the old accounts and found multiple instances of unpaid wages, and had sent letters to the people owed. Dorothy received a letter and a money order for the wages owed, with interest, not a large sum in the context of her current life, but one that meant something specific and particular. The universe, or at least its Abilene contingent, had eventually gotten the accounting right. She told Albert about it over dinner, and he looked at the money order and then at her and said, "What will you do with it?" Dorothy thought for a moment. "Books," she said, "for the school." He smiled at her across the table. Edmund, in his chair, was engaged in the energetic destruction of a piece of cornbread and was not paying attention to adult conversation, which at his age he found largely irrelevant unless it concerned him directly. "Books," Albert said. "Of course." There were more years, and they were full ones. The ranch expanded in 1882 with the purchase of an adjacent parcel to the south. A good negotiation that Dorothy had identified the opportunity for, and Albert had executed, and they had gone together to finalize it at the county office. And the clerk behind the counter had addressed himself entirely to Albert, until Dorothy produced the financial documentation she had prepared, and the clerk had understood that she was not simply accompanying her husband, but was the person who had done the analysis that made the purchase advisable. Old habits of assumption died slowly in Harlan County. Dorothy was patient with the process, and firm, and over time the men of the county came to understand that Dorothy Norris was a woman whose opinion on financial matters you sought if you were smart and ignored at your own demonstrable cost. She was not aggressive about it. She simply continued to be right, and in most people's experience, being right consistently enough tends to eventually establish its own authority. In 1883, their second child was born, a daughter they named Clara Ruth Norris. Clara for Harlan Webb's wife, who had wept so beautifully at their wedding, and who had become a genuine friend over the years, and Ruth for Albert's mother, who he had loved and missed, and about whom Dorothy had heard enough stories to feel she understood her. Clara came into the world with a quiet alertness that was different from Edmund's imperious loudness, watching everything with wide, dark eyes, and Albert held her in the lamplight the first evening of her life, and sang her a low, tuneless song that was not quite any song Dorothy had ever heard and was entirely his own improvisation. And Dorothy watched him from the bed and felt a love so complete and so settled that it seemed to fill the room. Edmund, at 4 years old, received his sister with the complex mixture of enthusiasm and apprehension appropriate to a child who has been the center of a universe and is now discovering that the universe has expanded. He resolved this conflict primarily by appointing himself Clara's guardian and protector, a role he pursued with the earnest authority that was already, unmistakably, the core of his personality. The ranch in the mid-1880s was something that people in Harlan County pointed to when they wanted to talk about what good management and honest dealing looked like. Cobb Whitaker, who had been with Albert for over a decade, had come to speak of the Norris operation with the proprietary pride of someone who has seen a thing from the beginning and knows the full arc of it. The hands who worked there stayed turnover was low, because pay was fair and conditions were decent, and there was a sense, on the Norris ranch, that the people who ran it took their obligations seriously. Paulina Ray's had become, over the years, as essential to the household as the walls that held it up, and her relationship with Dorothy had settled into the warm, comfortable, slightly combative closeness of two strong-willed women who had decided they liked each other very much and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Paulina had opinions about everything: the cooking, the children, the management of the East Parcel orchard, Dorothy's tendency to work past dark, and she expressed them freely and then executed whatever decision was ultimately made with total commitment, because she was a professional, and she understood the difference between having opinions and having authority. Dorothy valued her beyond what any words she had found could adequately express, and Paulina knew this and considered it sufficient. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, there was still the porch. There were still the two chairs that had been there from the beginning, though they had been replaced once because the originals finally gave out, and the replacements had been chosen by Dorothy and Albert together at the store in town on a Saturday afternoon when Edmund was 8 months old, and strapped to Dorothy's front in the practical carrying arrangement that Paulina had devised. And the sight of Albert Norris standing in Harlan Webb's store with a look of complete seriousness, comparing the durability of 2 wooden chairs, while his wife nursed their infant son, and Harlan Webb tried not to be visibly delighted, was something that Webb told his wife about that evening, and that Clara Webb laughed about for years. The 2 chairs on the porch remained, and the evenings remained, and what was said in them continued to be what it had always been. The truth, in both directions, offered and received by 2 people who had found in each other the particular thing that cannot be described in a deed or an account book, but that makes everything else work. Dorothy looked back sometimes, in the way you look back once you have arrived somewhere, not with longing but with the curious wonder of someone mapping the distance traveled, at the woman who had ridden into Harlan County in the spring of 1878 with 2 tired horses and a letter of reference and a competence that had been, at that point, the whole of her equity in the world. She had been looking for work. She had been looking for fair pay and reliability, for a place where her skills would be valued and her labor repaid. She had found those things. She had also found 40 acres with a creek running through it, and a school on the bank of that creek, and a son who argued about everything with magnificent confidence, and a daughter who watched the world with deep, patient attention, and a foreman who could not compliment her without looking at a point 2 feet to her left, and a cook who was also her friend, and a town that had, slowly and not always graciously but genuinely, come to see her as someone who belonged to it and to whom it belonged. And she had found Albert. In 1885, there was a spring evening of particular beauty, the kind that Texas occasionally produces as though to remind everyone that this is why people stay in difficult country. The sky going through every shade of rose and gold and purple over the hills, the air warm and smelling of grass, the distant cattle moving like the slow tide she had thought of years ago. Edmund, 6 years old, was in the yard with a stick and an elaborate imagination. Clara, too, was asleep inside. Paulina had gone home to her own small house on the property that Albert had built for her 2 years prior, after she mentioned once, in passing, that she had not had a door of her own since her husband passed in 1879, and Albert had heard the once and acted on it without being asked again. Dorothy and Albert were on the porch. She was reviewing a document, a proposal she was drafting for the county, related to the school, and he was reading. After a while he set his book down and looked at her, and she looked up and found him watching her with that expression she knew now, the one that meant he was thinking something he was going to tell her as soon as he had the words. "What is it?" She said. "I was thinking about the day you came," he said. "The very first day. The very first day when you knocked on that door." He was quiet for a moment. "I had been alone a long time before that. I had told myself I was content with it. I had made a kind of peace with the idea that this," he gestured at the ranch, "the land, the evening, was mine alone, and that alone was how it would stay." "I know," Dorothy said. "You couldn't have known." "I could tell," she said. "You showed me the deed in the first 15 minutes. Nobody does that for purely practical reasons." Albert was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the honesty that she had always loved in him, "I don't know that I knew what I was doing. I knew I wanted you to stay. I knew the moment I opened the door and you stood there and said your name and asked if the position was still available. I knew that I wanted very much for the answer to be yes, in ways that I did not entirely understand at the time, and that had very little to do with bookkeeping. Dorothy looked at him in the fading light. "Albert, yes, I know." She reached over and put her hand on his arm, which was something she did more easily now than she had in the beginning, the leaning and the touching having become natural over the years in the way of things that are practiced until they are simply true. "I know exactly what you wanted, because you got it." He put his hand over hers. They sat in the evening together, the two chairs on the porch that had been there from the beginning, and the country was all around them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And in the yard, Edmund was conducting an argument with a fence post, and inside the house Clara was sleeping, and down the road the school by the creek was dark and waiting for Tuesday, and the books in the study were reconciled and clear. And the east parcel with the creek was in Dorothy's name, and had an orchard and a school on it and good water running through it, and the Norris ranch was sound and well managed and honest, and none of it had been inevitable. All of it had been chosen. All of it had been built, day, by two people who had been, separately, sufficient unto themselves, and who had discovered, unexpectedly and with considerable caution that eventually gave way to no caution at all, that together they were something better than sufficient. The evening went dark slowly, the stars arriving one by one as they always did, and Dorothy and Albert sat in their chairs and watched it happen, and the sound of Edmund's voice drifted across the yard, and somewhere in the house Clara made a small sound in her sleep, and Harlan County turned under the vast Texas sky, and it was home, and it was enough, and it was everything. Years later, when Edmund Norris was a grown man of 20 and Clara Norris was a strong-willed girl of 14 with her father's eyes and her mother's way of thinking, when the school on the east parcel had been replaced by a proper schoolhouse in town that Dorothy had campaigned for through an entire decade of letters and county meetings and patient, relentless advocacy, when Cobb Whittaker had retired to a small house near town and come back anyway because he could not bear to be away from the ranch he had helped build, when Paulina Reyes had outlived everyone's expectations including her own and still had opinions about the kitchen, when the Norris Ranch had become a landmark and a standard in Harlan County and 3 surrounding counties. In those later years, Dorothy sometimes thought about the woman on the road, 11 days from Abilene, coming into a country she did not know looking for something that she needed, not knowing yet what she would find. She thought about the door opening. She thought about the man on the other side of it. She thought about fair pay and reliability and what those things meant, and about all the things they did not mean, and about the extraordinary, impractical, completely worth it distance between what you set out looking for and what you find when you arrive. She had come looking for work. She had found a life. And Albert Norris, who was 50 years old and still tall and still given to silences that she knew how to read, who still held her hand with both of his the way he held his coffee cup in the mornings, who had loved her with a constancy and a depth that had never once made her feel smaller than she was. Albert Norris would sometimes come to find her in the evenings when she was sitting on the porch, and he would sit in the other chair, and he would look at her with that expression, the one that had been there from the first day and had never left, and he would say her name, and she would say, yes. And he would say whatever he had been thinking, or sometimes nothing at all, because sometimes they had been together long enough that thinking it was the same as saying it, and the stars would come out over Harlan County, and the creek would run through the east parcel. And in the house behind them, their children and eventually their children's children would be asleep or arguing or reading or growing up in the particular way that children grow up when they have been given the gift of a home that was built with love and maintained with honesty, growing up rooted, growing up knowing that the land beneath their feet was theirs not by accident but by intention, not by luck but by the long, daily, beautiful work of two people who had chosen each other and their life together every single day. Dorothy Finley had ridden into Harlan County in the spring of 1878 looking for work. She had found everything.